All right, so today we're diving deep right into a concept, well, it seems simple on the surface. Judgment.
Yeah, judgment.
We're diving into Oliver O'Donovan's The Ways of Judgment. And,
Yeah.
This isn't just some law school lecture,
Right.
This is about how we, everyone figures out right and wrong in the world. How these judgments, they kind of build the world we live in,
What's fascinating about O'Donovan is, well, he doesn't limit judgment to, courtrooms, laws being laid down.
Yeah.
He's saying that anytime we're trying to figure out right and wrong, especially in our social lives, political lives, we're making judgment.
Constant, right. Every day, is this a good deal? Is someone acting out of line? Should I have another slice of cake? I mean, the big question. But seriously, this is way bigger than just dessert.
Absolutely. O'Donovan, he really wants us to get those deep philosophical, even theological underpinnings of judgment, He's digging into the limitations, how messy it can be, but then why it's crucial for a healthy society.
Okay, so let's break this down. Right away, these excerpts hit us with this paradox of political authority. We love to talk about freedom, individual freedom, but then we live within systems, governments, laws, institutions, and they put limits on that freedom. It's like, where does this authority even come from, and why should we just accept it?
So O'Donovan uses this quote. It's really thought-provoking. He says, political authority realizes goods that never were the ends of our action, and political authority is not itself a means to realize anyone's end. What he's saying is, we don't just decide, sit down and hammer out political authority like some social contract, but it's there. It's influencing us constantly.
It's less we the people and more that just kind of appears.
In a way, yeah. O'Donovan, he uses the concept of providence to explain it. But before we get too into theology, think of it like this. What if this authority is just part of being human? Not something we invented, but something that emerges because of how we are, how we interact, relate to each other.
Okay, that helps, makes it less, just a word, providence.
Yeah.
But this is what gets me, right? If this authority is just there, even if we don't fully get where it's from, how do we judge the judgments, those N authority? Because, come on, governments, leaders, they mess up. Big time, sometimes.
You're right on. That's the heart of it. Imperfect judgment, even at the top,
Mm-hmm.
O'Donovan uses a great historical example. Amnesty. Think about revolutions, wars, like the French Revolution, the Reign of Terror. Justice, vengeance, that line gets so blurry.
Totally. After something like that, how do you even decide who's accountable, who to forgive? How do you make things right without becoming the oppressor? Is a huge dilemma.
And O'Donovan, he highlights this with a quote. It's about Savonarola during the Florentine Revolution back in 1494. In the Republican Revolution of Florence in 1494, Savonarola famously insisted upon amnesty for supporters of the ousted Medici. Savonarola famously insisted upon vendetta. Makes you really think about what punishment is even for.
Revenge, making people suffer. Or something totally different. Rehabilitation, preventing future harm. It's making me think about all the criminal justice debates we see now. Are we trying to do justice or just repeating the same harmful patterns?
O'Donovan, he doesn't shy away from the tough stuff. He looks at where public judgment should and shouldn't have power. He says, God knows the thoughts of the heart and will publish them. We too may know some thoughts, but they are inexpressible in the public sphere. So there are boundaries to what we should judge.
There's a difference between what's fair game for public scrutiny and what should be private.
Exactly. And this connects to things like, he talks about political surveillance. Think about facial recognition, all the data being collected, the need to protect our private lives, families, friendships from intrusion.
Man, that's relevant now with all this talk about privacy in the digital age. It's like he was writing for us today.
Mm-hmm.
But he didn't stop there, did he? He challenges this idea we have that justice always means everyone gets the same thing.
You're right. He uses a really powerful example talking about, how resources are divided up. He says, and I quote, "The right number of black police in the force cannot be determined as an arithmetic equivalent to the number of white police. Neither can it be determined as a proportional figure corresponding to the ratio of blacks to whites in the population."
That's a strong statement. It's not just about plugging numbers into some equation and calling it justice. It makes you think about the real needs, the history of different communities. How do you ensure fair policing somewhere that's always been over-policed, targeted unfairly? It's just more complicated than everyone gets the same.
Exactly. O'Donovan wants us to move past those simple ideas of equality and really grapple with how justice works in real life, with all its messiness.
Okay, so if judgment itself is flawed, limited, what else is there? O'Donovan seems to be pointing at something bigger, really deep, real communication as crucial for a good, healthy society.
He uses this Greek word, koinonia. Doesn't translate perfectly, but think. Community, communion, communication, sharing something fundamental, this idea that we understand each other, maybe even share a purpose. That's what really makes a society work, according to O'Donovan.
He takes it back to the early church, right? That part in Acts where it says, the full number of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and no one said that any of the things that belonged to him was his own, but they had everything in common. This radical idea of community, built on shared values, helping each other.
And it shows the limits of relying only on judgment to hold things together. O'Donovan's suggesting that real social harmony, it needs more than just saying what's right and wrong. It needs genuine communication, understanding, and that willingness to share, that koinonia.
So you were asking about making this practical, right?
Yeah, totally.
One thing O'Donovan brings up is this old Greek idea, epikeia.
Epikeia.
It's like sometimes just following the letter of the law without thinking about the situation of the person, it can actually create more injustice.
It's like the law is an ass thing, right? You gotta have common sense, too.
Exactly. And O'Donovan, he traces this idea through Christian history, how it went from just being reasonable to being about mercy, you know?
Okay.
Yeah.
He talks about Seneca, who thought clemency, that was the sign of a wise judge, especially an emperor. Someone who could actually make the most just outcome, not by being rigid, but knowing when the law needed bending.
It's interesting. Mercy and power, right? You'd think power is all about enforcing the rules, but maybe it's knowing when to bend them. That's the real skill.
And then, of course, with O'Donovan, this gets very Christian. He goes to the Gospels, those stories of Jesus, the woman caught in adultery, or that parable, the unforgiving servant. Jesus changes how we see judicial power completely.
So not being above a law, but realizing we're all under it, even the powerful people, humbling yourself, showing mercy because you know you need it too.
Yeah. O'Donovan brings in William Perkins, this Protestant theologian, who connects mercy to the fact that we all face judgment, divine judgment.
Like if we know we're going to be judged by a higher power, we're less likely to be so harsh on others.
Exactly. It keeps our egos in check. And this should even change how we think about punishment. O'Donovan, he's adamant that it shouldn't just be about making people suffer. It has to communicate truth.
Communicate truth. That's different. How does that work practically?
Well, he's saying that punishment, when it's done right, it forces the person who did wrong to really confront what they did, the harm, their own responsibility, the moral order of things.
So less about getting even, more about them understanding, taking responsibility.
Right. And this focus on truth, it should guide what punishments we even consider just. O'Donovan, he'd be against anything degrading, dehumanizing, turning someone into a spectacle. Specifically, he talks about punishments worse than death, torture. He sees those as barbaric, pointless.
Wow, that's a strong stance. It's easy to fall into that eye for an eye trap. But he's pushing for something more healing, I guess, focused on truth, and even the possibility of things being made right between people. It makes you think about our justice system, Does it really line up with that?
It's a challenge, for sure. And building on that, O'Donovan, he's critical of how obsessed we are with rights, like they're the answer to everything.
Yeah.
He's worried that this focus on my rights, your rights, it blinds us to the common good, what's good for everyone.
Like we're all so ready to lawyer up, defend our own little corner. We forget we have responsibilities too, not just to ourselves, but to each other, the whole community.
Right. He wants us to move past these transactional relationships where it's all about, I've got this right, you've got that right. True justice, he says, it needs a bigger view. One that's concerned with everyone flourishing, not just me getting mine.
And that takes real communication, doesn't it? Not just arguing, but really listening, trying to understand where the other person's coming from.
Absolutely. And that's where his ideas about representation, political authority, they come back in. Government, it's not just about laws and rights. It should represent the common good, upholding the shared values, the traditions that hold a community together.
Representation's tricky, though, isn't it? How do we know those in power are really representing us, not just their own interests?
O'Donovan acknowledges that. He says the old social contract idea, that we consent to be governed, it's got holes.
It's like, who watches the watchmen, right? Even if we vote, how do we keep the powerful ones accountable?
He says true representation is bigger than just elections, mechanisms. It needs a shared identity, people feeling connected to their leaders. He uses this phrase, mysterious alchemy of the affections. It's like a community recognizing itself in its leaders.
You can't just force that with rules, can you? It has to be deeper. Trust, shared goals, something like that.
Exactly. And he thinks it comes from a community's shared history, their traditions, what they've been through together. He's critical of how we see society now, just a bunch of individuals, each doing their own thing.
It's true, right? We've lost that community feeling, that knowing that we're all in this together, like that image, everyone bowling alone. It's kind of sad, but it's where we're at.
And O'Donovan, he's saying this loss matters. It hurts our ability to judge well, to communicate, to build a society that's truly just, where everyone can thrive.
So what's the answer? How do we get back that community, that understanding that what's good for one is good for all?
Well, he thinks it starts with how we see things.
Yeah.
Recognizing we're connected, that we're part of something bigger than just our own wants, our own goals. He talks about a cosmopolitan outlook, not like trendy cosmopolitan, but realizing we're all humans sharing this planet, this destiny.
So like expanding who we care about, realizing that what happens across the world does affect us.
Right. And that means facing our own prejudices, assumptions about other cultures, ways of life, trying to find common ground even when it's tough.
Like we need to become citizens of the world, not just our own little corner of it.
And O'Donovan's saying this global citizenship, it's not optional anymore. It's how we face the big stuff. Climate change, poverty, all the conflicts. These are problems we have to solve together.
It's daunting, but also kind of inspiring. He's calling us to something beyond ourselves, right? This shared responsibility for humanity.
He is. But he also says this isn't just lofty ideals. It's about what we do every day, how we treat each other, the choices we make, how we engage with the world.
So not just talking about a better world, but actually building it, one interaction at a time.
Exactly. And O'Donovan, he thinks the church, this community that crosses borders, that embodies that koinonia we talked about, it's got a huge role to play.
So the church is supposed to be a model, a real-life example of what a global community can be.
Yes. He even calls it counter-political, like it can challenge the way things are, speak truth to power, push for a more just, compassionate world.
That's a bold statement. It's like the church has a prophetic role, calling out injustice, inspiring people to demand better.
And he ties this directly to eschatology, the belief in God's ultimate justice.
So it's not just making things a little better now, but pointing towards something radically different.
Yeah.
A world transformed by love and justice.
Exactly. O'Donovan's vision, it's challenging, but so hopeful too. He doesn't sugarcoat how hard judgment is, how messy human communication can be, but he offers a glimpse of a future worth fighting for.
And honestly, in a world that feels so divided, that's what we need to hear. But I gotta ask, how do we hold on to that hope? With all the bad stuff happening, how do you keep going?
That's the question, isn't it? And it brings us right back to the longest part. That inner journey, cultivating conscience, compassion, like O'Donovan talks about.
So not just having the right ideas, the right words, but the right heart, the right way of being inside.
Exactly. Because in the end, he argues, the world we create reflects the people we are.
That's powerful. It gets to the core of what it means to truly live a good life, doesn't it?
It does. And it makes us ask ourselves, how do our own lives, our thoughts, beliefs, values, how do those shape how we interact with the world?
That's something worth thinking about. You know, it's easy to feel overwhelmed, like how do we actually change the world? But O'Donovan seems to be saying it starts with us, right? That inner work he talks about, building our own sense of compassion, justice. Yeah. But then how do we actually live that, especially in the church?
That's where it gets really interesting. O'Donovan, he uses this image, the church, as a city. This community shaped by the world, yeah, but also able to shape the world around it through how it worships, how it serves. Even just by being a real community, it can be a different way of being, you know? Rooted in love, justice, that common good we were talking about.
So it's like the church is supposed to be countercultural, like going against the grain, showing a totally different way to live together.
He even says post-political, this vision he has. It's like pointing to a future where God's justice, God's peace, it's bigger than all the human systems, the power struggles, all that.
Okay, gotta admit, that's pretty radical. Not just tweaking things, but imagining something totally new. But how do we even wrap our heads around that in everyday life?
That's where the rubber meets the road, right? O'Donovan says through that radical commitment, koinonia, forgiveness, reconciliation, that unwavering support for each other. That's how the church shows what a just, compassionate world could be.
Like it's meant to be this sign of contradiction, almost. Living by a different set of rules. Or, I guess, values more than rules.
And that different way of living, that koinonia, comes from the longest part, you know? That inner change when we really take that inward journey O'Donovan's always talking about.
You're saying real change out there, it has to start with a change in here. Gestures to heart. not just the right ideas, but becoming the kind of people who live them.
Exactly. O'Donovan's whole point is this isn't just like private spirituality, feel-good stuff. It has to mean something in the real world. We have to become the people who build a just world where mercy, love, they're not just ideas, but how we actually live.
I think a lot of us want that,
Yeah,
especially now, that sense of purpose, being part of something good, something bigger.
for sure. And O'Donovan challenges us to stop just dreaming about a better world, but to get to work building it. It's the small stuff, the choices we make, how we treat each other day in, day out. That's how it starts to happen.
Like connecting that inner work, the longest part, to how we act in the world, bringing those two together. Our values have to show in what we do.
You got it. It starts with us, each of us inside. Then it moves outward, our relationships, our communities, and eventually the big systems, the way the world works.
This deep dive, it's given us a lot to think about. I know for me, it's changed how I see judgment. It's not just calling people out, making pronouncements, but this deep process, figuring things out, wrestling with hard stuff, and ultimately choosing mercy, compassion, even when, or maybe especially when, it's tough.
I'm with you on that. And for everyone listening, I think O'Donovan leaves us with a big question. How do we judge not, but also speak up against injustice? It's a balance, right? A tension. But figuring that out, that messy, complicated space, that's where we find out what it means to actually build a better world.
It's like judgment is never the end. It's the start of a bigger conversation. With ourselves, with each other, with the world. So keep thinking, keep asking the hard questions, and keep trying to live out justice, mercy, love in all you do.